I'm Freya Camburn. I'm a Senior Policy Analyst at Bay Plenty Regional Council. Been working on geothermal policy probably for about the past 8 years now. Based in the Whakatane office. So we have offices all around the Bay, as you know. So based in the Whakatane office, here with Elsa Weir, who is a senior planner, has been working with us in the geothermal team for about 3 or 4 years now. So, Bay?
18 months, geothermal.
Wow, it's a good time flies.
Yeah.
So Elsa's been doing a lot of the main hard graph between the policy and the policy drafting for our plan change work. She's going to present on that. We've also got Penny Dorman with us here today, geothermal program leader, who I think most of you are well familiar with. Next slide, yeah. So we're just here to talk to you today about the 2 key pieces of work that we are currently seeking feedback from the community on. So one of those is Plan Change 11 or PC 11, which is our geothermal plan change. It covers all geothermal systems in the entire Bay of Plenty region, of which we have about 12 main ones that we talk about and manage. This is following off the back of a lot of work that you will all be familiar with that we've been doing around the Rotorua System Management Plan. So we've spent the last kind of 4 or 5 years working on that. That has now culminated in us progressing with this draft plan change. We also have now out for feedback our Tauranga Geothermal System Management Plan. So 2 key streams in our integrated geothermal management approach. So I'm going to hand over to Elsa now, and she's going to take you through a bit more of the details on both of those. Maybe it might be easiest to hold the questions until the end, I think, rather than jumping in and out. But we think we've probably got about 15 minutes of talking, and then there should be plenty of time for questions at the end.
Awesome. Thanks, Freya. So what are these things that Freya's just mentioned to you? So you'll likely be fairly familiar with our Regional Natural Resources Plan and our Rotorua Geothermal Regional Plan. And those are our regulatory documents that contain the actual policies and rules for our geothermal management. So the system management plans, or SMPs, are the non-regulatory companion to those plans with the rules in them. They provide a whole system approach to integrated management for specific high-use geothermal systems. And they do this by setting out the vision for the system and providing a bit more operational guidance for both users and decision makers. So as Freya mentioned, we've currently got an SMP in place for Rotorua after many years of hard work, and we also have one in place for our Kawerau system. So the SMPs are all slightly different, given that they deal with really different geothermal systems, but the structure of the Tauranga SMP is going to be quite similar to that of the Rotorua one. So these documents sit within our wider geothermal policy framework with the overall direction given to us by our regional policy statement. And then those regional plans and our system management plans sit under that. As you can see, it starts getting more and more complicated. We've got geothermal provisions in the RNRP, the RGRP, the coastal plan, the Tauranga River catchment plan, and we also need to consider alignment with freshwater provisions, particularly when looking at our Tauranga system due to the interconnected aquifers there. So what this all hopefully adds up to is the integrated management of geothermal, which I actually prefer thinking about a bit more like this. So in terms of the plan change, one of the main drivers is that both plans have been well overdue for review. So the existing Rotorua Geothermal Regional Plan has been needing a pretty serious overhaul. It was made operative in 1999, so we're kind of well past the RMA required 10-year review period. And then in terms of the RNRP, that's kind of pretty fundamentally okay, but could do with some updating for best practice. So as well as the direction from that regional policy statement and the system management plans, inputs that have then influenced our policy development include findings from our RMA Section 35 efficiency and effectiveness reviews, technical and science inputs, hapu and iwi management plans, and feedback from early engagement. After that, we've then gone through, reviewed and updated all the provisions, and then we're consolidating them into one chapter, one geothermal chapter in our RNRP. We've also worked really hard on the basis of simplifying and streamlining wherever possible. So, for example, the Rotorua Geothermal Regional Plan just on its own stands at about 155 pages. Draft plan change 11, which covers Rotorua and the whole region, sitting at about 30 pages in total. So hopefully a bit more user-friendly. So looking now into some more of the details of what we're talking about with all these amazing updates and changes. So one of the foundations of the plan is ensuring that we're striking that right balance between protecting the geothermal resource and then enabling economic development where it's safe to do that. So in that vein, we've been working on amendments to our guiding policy to clarify the intent of our system classification management groups. So that's like our protected systems versus our development systems, trying to make it really clear there, the different levels of protection and what we're sort of happy with and not happy with in each of those systems. We've also been clarifying the management of significant geothermal features, so where they are, and again, what level of protection we're expecting for them. We've then brought in a new objective to protect customary practices, and then to sit alongside that, we've got specific take, use, and discharge rules to provide for those practices. After some pretty heavy input from our compliance team, we're looking at a new policy for the use of bonds in relation to geothermal wells. We've then also updated our natural hazards provisions to align with our RPS natural hazards chapter. And then, of course, our Rotorua SMP implementation. So as Freya noted, we've spent around 5 years developing that system management plan with heaps of engagement, really robust technical input. And so that's given us a really good grounding to bring all that now into our actual plan and put those policies and rules in place. So that looks like things like a new objective embedding the vision from the SMP, so protecting the mauri and the health of Ngā Waiariki o Rotorua, the establishment of our sensitive management areas, the inclusion of allocation limits to protect the mauri and the health of the system, and then policies and rules to give effect to the values-based allocation priorities. We also have our freshwater alignment and then a more enabling approach for the Tauranga system. And I'll talk a bit more about this later, but essentially at the moment, despite being quite a unique system, being a low temperature system, in regulatory terms, we're basically treating it the same as the rest of our systems, and we want to better enable geoheat opportunities there. So this brings me on to feedback for you to consider. So we're really keen for any and all feedback on the draft plan. That's kind of the point of putting out a draft, but we have got a few specific questions for you here to have a think about. So I mentioned that classification approach with our geothermal management groups. You know, does industry still support that approach as a good tool to strike that balance between protection and use? Another thing you might have noticed if you've had a look at the maps that we've put out is that geothermal occurrences have had their own little group made, group 7. Is this actually necessary? Is this something that you see as being helpful or would support? The other thing in relation to mapping that you might have noticed is we've actually set a bit of a floor for the Rotorua system. So anything deeper than 100 metres NZVD would be considered a research system. Do we need to do this for all the other systems, or is it only appropriate for Rotorua? We've also obviously been thinking about geoheat and about supercritical as emerging issues in the geothermal space. Are the right issues being addressed by the plan, and have these issues been addressed adequately? And then always the fun one, are there any unintended consequences or perverse outcomes? And so a good example of that, particularly as, you know, policy planners get a bit excited about simplifying and streamlining. A good example may be something like streamlining our drilling rules. So there was about 5 in the existing RNRP, and there didn't seem to be a huge amount of difference between them. So it made sense to us internally to combine those all into one rule. But we're really keen to know from users of the plan and people who are sort of working in this area, does it actually make sense, or have we kind of missed something really crucial? Hopefully not, but really keen to hear that from you guys. So I just also want to stress here again, like it is a draft, and the purpose of a draft is to keep getting information to improve the document before we get to the notification stage. So as well as making changes as a result of any feedback we receive, there will also be some refinement of numbers and mapping in the document. We're not anticipating that those will be large-scale changes, but just making sure that we do get everything dialed in as much as possible as we go through the process, and we obviously continue to learn more and more. So now moving from the plan change over more to that Tauranga SMP, you'll probably all much more up to speed with the Tauranga geothermal system than I am. But in terms of our policy context, it's classed as one of our Group 5 low temperature systems. There's currently about 130 consented takes across that system, and these are for a variety of uses, including space heating, water heating, and bathing. But about 24% of the takes are actually being used for non-geothermal uses, like irrigation, where that heat's not actually desired or needed. So the biggest challenge for us is therefore trying to ensure fair and integrated management across those interconnected groundwater and geothermal aquifers, and avoiding the impacts that they can have on one another. So this is where the draft Tauranga System Management Plan steps in. The structure for the System Management Plan sets out the purpose, background and context for the system, a bit of context about SMPs, the vision and principles, and our proposed management approach. So that management approach is going to cover those key issues in dealing with those interconnected aquifers and providing for both the use of freshwater and geothermal. So it's going to include things like avoiding cooling, so the effects of groundwater takes on heat, avoiding over-allocation of water. So that might look like geothermal takes staying within groundwater allocation limits where those exist. Avoiding contamination and cooling from geothermal discharges. Protection of cultural geothermal values, particularly where there is still surface expression, like the Maketū spring. Requiring the efficient use of heat where that's reasonable to do so. And recognising the low temperature geoheat opportunity in the Tauranga system and being more enabling of those opportunities. So the SMP has drawn on iwi and hapu management plans, more science and technical inputs and initial engagement. It's then going to be supported by an action plan and guidelines, so things like discharge guidelines, drilling guidelines. It'll inform our Plan Change 11, and then it will be used in decision making, so most often consent applications. So this brings me back kind of around to the plan change. So if you've had a look, you might be wondering, what's actually happening with the rules for the low temperature systems? So, and you might have seen, if you've had a look at the draft, all these little kind of nice red drafting notes pointing you to the freshwater chapter. So due to the roughly aligned timing of both our geothermal plan change and the freshwater plan change that our water policy team was running, we had initially thought that we could achieve some super efficient policy magic and have the take, use, damming, diversion, discharge and drilling of geothermal and geothermal management group 5 be covered by any updated provisions in the proposed freshwater chapter, and that this would better reflect that interconnected nature of the geothermal and groundwater resource. However, the government has recently thrown a small spanner in the works by delaying all the freshwater plan changes, and so it's looking like we're just going to need to pull those provisions back into our geothermal chapter. The really good thing for us with the timing, or the silver lining, I guess, is that we have had this Tauranga SMP process going on at the same time as the draft plan change. So that means we can still be having and have been having these really good conversations about the Tauranga system, what people value, what people want to see in that management approach, and how and what they understand about that sort of interconnected nature of the system and how we need to manage it as one. And so at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter where those policies and rules sit, whether it's the freshwater chapter or the geothermal chapter, as long as they make sense and they're aligned when they're considering the same issues. And so a good example of what I mean when I say dealing with the same issues is there's currently a permitted activity rule in the freshwater plan for small groundwater takes. I think of about 35 cubes per day. But any take of geothermal water in the same area definitely requires a resource consent. And so maybe this is appropriate and needs to be the case, but it is a pretty difficult sell to people that if the water is 29 degrees, you can take it, no worries. But if it's 30, you have to go through your consent process. And then, as I'm sure you can imagine, there's a really large number of 29-degree takes in the system. So this is another part of the plan change and the SMP, because they do work together nicely. Excuse me, that would love your feedback on. So speaking of feedback, here's our next step. So both those drafts are out for feedback now. We're directing people to our Participate web portal. I've got the 2 links there. They're both sitting on their own pages. You've got the drafts, there's maps, there's supporting documents, science stories, everything you could ever possibly wish to read about these documents. We're also really conscious, though, that there's a lot going on in the legislative space. And so we've gone for quite a long feedback period. So there's another 2 months until this round closes on the 31st of January 2025. And then once that happens, the two processes kind of diverge. The SMP is a little bit more straightforward. We have our councillors consider the feedback, and then we hope that it's adopted by our council sometime in 2025. But the plan change is kind of just ramping up. So sort of for the first half of next year, we'll be looking at that feedback, refining the draft based on the feedback, and then hopefully late 2025, all going well, we'll be notifying that plan change for formal consultation. So just to finish, I just really want to thank everyone for listening and acknowledge that we've just sped through quite a lot of information at a really high level. So we're really happy to take questions now, but you can also email us. We've got our special geothermal email there, or get in touch later. And we're also more than happy to meet with people to go through any questions or concerns that you have. And so I just really want to stress, while we've got that feedback period, engagement outside of that process is just going to keep going on until we actually get to that formal notification stage. So please come talk to us. Thank you.
So I'm with Contact Energy. I'm in the last couple of years through our reconsenting at Waihi, the focus on the interaction of groundwater and geothermal resources has become prominent and important, and we've kind of started using groundwater modeling and different types of things to communicate those things or test those sensitivities. And then just curious, in a situation where you might have, are you defining any sort of co-management of the consent holders if they're in a certain radius of each other, or those sorts of things, to be able to study their individual versus cumulative effects?
Yeah, sorry, I'm struggling to hear a little bit, but I think you're asking about whether through the consenting process, whether we can taking into account the effects of one user on another. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, sorry. I think I had my I had the headset on the microphone, but the speakers didn't. My ears were getting hot. Anyway, yeah, I was just curious if you have any sort of plan for management of effects when you've got multiple users within a certain proximity of one another to study that cumulative effect on the resources?
Yeah, so definitely we do. So specifically, I guess a good example of that is in the Rotorua system. We've acknowledged that because there's a number of small users, that cumulative effect can be quite profound, right? So the environmental effects from lots of small users on the system is something that we need to be aware of and that we consider through that consent application process. It's kind of the whole point of the SMP, is to say, how do we look at this as a collective whole? How do we manage the system in an integrated way? That's quite different to Kawerau, for example, where you've got, as you'd be aware, a few tappers all working together collectively to manage the system. But again, that is dealt with through the system management plan. So those users on that system work together to kind of agree through the system management plan how they're going to address any issues as they arise. So that's probably a couple of examples. So for Rotorua, Council's kind of taking care of it by looking at the cumulative impact as we're processing consents. Kawerau, it's addressed more at a user level, but through the SMP process, with Council being part of that process.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I guess just as example, like some of the work that we're doing with iwi and hapu is that some of the effects from the deep resources are quite strong, but also the particularly diversion of surface water or over pumping of groundwater becomes a tricky area to actually understand whose effect is what and the timing of those things. And there's been a couple of cases in Taupo where proposals for resource takes have been kind of shied away from because they don't actually have much support in terms of either technical capabilities or support from a public perspective, with iwi hapu having some specific questions about sustainability and things, and small consent applicants struggle to have the resources to answer those questions.
Okay, thanks, Matt.
Yeah.
Right, any other questions? I think I'll take it as a comment, that last bit, rather than another question. So yeah.
Yeah, it was.
Thanks.
Brian, I have a
Kenny.
question. This is
Kenny.
Kenny from New Zealand Geothermal Association. So thank you so much for your information. Are you able to help us to learn more about the customary practices that described in your proposed plan? What are you envisaging, please?
Yeah, so in terms of the permitted use, is that what you're, yeah, so we've approached it through the system, developing the Rotorua System Management Plan. We got so much feedback on those types of uses and what was customary and what needed to be available and protected to enable those types of uses to continue. So there's kind of it's a bit of a hierarchy, and there's two strands to that. So there's customary uses which have gone on for all time, for example. So bathing, cooking kai, medicinal use, they are low impact, and there needs to be, the system needs to be protected to enable those uses to continue. They don't require a well, so they come under the RMA under that section 14.3C permitted activity, because they do not have an environmental effect. Okay, they're low impact, don't require a consent, none of council's business. That should continue as it has for the past 1,000 years, should be able to continue. Our job is to make sure that the system is still healthy enough to enable that to continue. The next tier down that Elsa referred to in terms of we've kind of crafted some policies and rules around protecting that next level of customary use. What we're talking about there is those users that may need to use a well to access the geothermal heat. So that automatically throws you into a consenting regime, because from regional council's perspective, if you're using a well, there is an environmental effect. It's not a permitted activity under the Act. So what we're saying there is that those uses are still really important and need to be protected. So that is things like heating a marae, or being able to use the heat in a marae to cook, for example, or papakaiing a housing. Those types of uses, we're saying they're really important, and it's council's job to make sure that there is geothermal available for those types of uses. What we've done in Rotorua is we've tried to make the consenting pathway a little, through activity status, make it a bit easier for those uses to be prioritised. So we've made the next step down, I'm not sure how familiar you are more with policy writing. So the next step down from a permitted activity is a controlled activity. And so that's what we've done. We've said some of these uses are controlled. We need to know about them because we need to know where these wells are drilled for safety reasons. But apart from that, they're very low impact. And as long as there's no major environmental effects, then council says, yes, you can have your consent. So council can't decline those consents unless there's effects that can't be managed. Does that make sense?
Thank you. I understand the tiered approach. Kenny, you good with that? Okay, thank you. Any other questions?
Yeah, I'll get one, and just to be fair, how are we going, girls?
Hi, Mitch.
Thanks for
Hey.
your submission.
All good. I thought I'd get it in early. I've been sitting on it for a while. I'm sure Penny loved it. Just a quick one from me is we're quite often seeing the effects on the geothermal reservoirs, like depletion, extraction, exploitation. It's common terms in the geothermal industry when it comes to reservoirs. Now, Rotorua, I guess, saw a large reservoir decline. We saw a lot of surface features disappear. We saw the groundwater table drop as well, and a whole bunch of effects coming from that. The town as such kind of moved on, and we had a lot of built infrastructure going in those areas which were formerly hot zones or areas that you wouldn't build on. And so we reached kind of a new state of equilibrium, and then what we've seen is that the reservoir has come back, it has returned, and there's probably some return likely still to come. What I haven't seen so much is where like, I guess, a managed approach on the reservoir in some areas has to anticipate the effects on the built environment, and I guess where people's expectations on the surface are that their buildings will be safe from geothermal surface features or their bores or their backyard coming to life again. Yeah, how do we sort of anticipate that? Is it tough?
Are you asking if I've got enough precision in my management to be able to stop that from a spring popping up in somebody's backyard? And I know you're not. Yeah.
We all know. Well, yeah, we all know the plumbing's very hard to read down there, but it's I guess it's
It is absolutely a big problem. And some, if you just look at it through an environmental lens, it's a great problem to have, right? You say this is wonderful, the reservoir is recovering, the system is healthy. It's never happened before anywhere else. So it's a very, very positive story. Where it's not positive is where it potentially puts people's lives at risk. It can be dangerous. We all know that. How do we manage that? Elsa can probably speak to the hazard side of it better than I can, because she's been working really closely with Rotorua Lakes Council. And we think we're heading in the right direction in terms of the practice notes that they've been developing. But do you want to?
Yeah, so what we've kind of done, while lacking that precision to just manage the system amazingly, we did a lot of work with RLC. You'll recall the medium density housing standards that came out. They had to go through a plan change, and they were going, yeah, awesome, we can have 3 dwellings permitted on a site. And we went, oh my God, not in the geothermal system. And so we submitted on that. We managed to get a provision put into the district plan that requires a site-specific assessment be done at the time of any sort of development within that Rotorua geothermal system overlay. You need a suitably qualified and experienced person to kind of go through and check, are you near surface features, what's happening, what's the ground temp, and then kind of also respond to, do you need to do anything to make sure it's even just not going to be too hot within your dwelling? I know I used to work in an office down on the lakefront where it was just unbearably hot all the time. So kind of covering a bit more holistically all those factors rather than just relying on the Building Act to tick off that hazards approach. And then what trickled out of that is a set of practice notes. And so that's to help people understand that site-specific assessment and what we're wanting people to go through and consider. And a big part of that, honestly, is just to try and raise that awareness. So people aren't, kind of building and just thinking that it's all going to be great. They do need to consider that geothermal hazard, and particularly ongoing mitigations. I feel like there's a real lack. You put in your cobblestones or something to help things breathe, but then someone else comes along and then just concretes over it, so trying to build up that education and awareness in the city as well.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
George, you've got a question?
I have a real quick comment. I don't know Mitch, but he raised a very good question as a former Rotorua resident and etc. and also on EQC and dealing with the insurance issues that arise. I'm just interested, but just real quick one. So one of the issues, of course, in the oil and gas industry, which is impact on Taranaki, don't know what the effect it impacted in the geothermal in Tauranga, is well abandonment. So does your policy cover well abandonment? So if people do a well and they abandon it, they actually have to complete the well, and then that's all ticked off and accepted. There isn't any more situations like we have in the past right throughout, both for South Island, North Island, New Zealand, and oil, gas and coal seam gas as well, coal as well, actually, to be honest, where people have actually done drilling and gone away, and subsequently there's been an exposure to normally to the local to the property owner, or potentially to local government, or even to the Crown at times. So have you dealt with well abandonment? I just asked a question.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question, and we felt it was an area where there was a gap in our policy framework previously. We've tried to address that through this plan change. That is part of the reason that we've included the policy on bonds, and the requirement for bonds is specifically to pick up on that well abandonment issue.
So I've advised government on that, oil and gas, and told them that bonds was actually a false premise. It doesn't actually solve the risk, but I won't go there. Bonds don't work.
Yeah, so
because you just disappear. I mean, you just disappear. Who's the and also it actually ignores the benefit factor. So I'm strongly, but we won't have an argument. But I'm strongly opposed to bonds.